Good evening. As a single full-time working parent, get the end of the month, no fun money anymore. When do you think I can expect to feel better off financially?
Never.
Well, I'm sure you're not the only person asking that question, Lee. Jack?
I mean, we've been hearing a lot over the last year and a half now about the cost of living crisis, as though it's fallen out of a clear blue sky. And it's not a cost of living crisis, let's be absolutely clear, although it is for everybody at the sharp end of it, and that's millions and millions of people. It's a cost of Conservatives crisis, it's a cost of austerity crisis, it's a cost of...
A cost of capitalism crisis, perchance? Definitely a cost of neoliberalism crisis.
13 years of pulverising all social support and all of those safety nets that we used to have in place that propped up the fundamentals of a decent society. It's a cost of stripping out the NHS and social care and refuges and welfare and all the support that many, many people and voters might have thought they never would have needed. They didn't think that they were going to ever be one of those people who would have to dip into those pots. And now that it's affecting sort of the chattering classes, the middle classes, the media classes, it's been given a fancy title, the cost of living crisis, and it's affecting almost everybody.
No, I wouldn't be surprised if Jack was upset. They get really emotional about this stuff, and with good reason. I mean, look at the kind of things that they have to engage in their own job, in like the on their day-to-day life, and what the kind of things that they have to see, and what the life that they've lived through that they know other people are now living through as well. So I mean, they definitely would be upset. I mean, and they are incredibly forward with the criticisms that they have about this kind of stuff. I mean, there was a moment on Politics Live I covered on my program about a year ago now, it was quite a while back now, literally saying that, right, we have some economic green shoots that are growing right now, and they've been built upon the bodies of the dead people that have been failed by the Conservative government. And literally face to face with a Tory MP said, your government has killed people. I'm like, well, this is the first time you'll see that first and last time you'll see that on the BBC.
To absolutely not answer your question, I'm afraid, I don't know where this ends or when this ends. I've been working with food banks and with people in poverty for the last 10 years. I've never known anything like the sheer scale of desperation and crisis that we're facing at the moment as a country. And the only thing that is going to change it is investment back into all of those services that have been stripped away, and making sure that when people find themselves in a desperate situation, that there's some help and some support out there for them. And I hope for your sake and everybody else's sake that happens yesterday, but certainly sooner rather than later.
And Jack, can I ask you, one suggestion from the government is possibly a voluntary agreement with the supermarkets to cap the prices of some goods. Do you think that will make much difference?
Again, it's one of those short-term solutions that will help people out for 5 minutes, like the money for the energy funds or the £20 uplift for universal credit that was then taken away. But what the government need to do is they need to invest in wages, and they need to invest in social care and support, and they need to invest in benefits, because capping the price of milk will help people this week, but it just means that supermarkets will push up the prices of other essential products that might not have made the shortlist. So your overall...
And also just in general, right, is that Jack has made this point very clearly on their social media channels before, right? The square root of fuck all is still fuck all, right? It doesn't matter if the price of bread and milk is capped. If you cannot afford anything because you have no money left after all of your expensive bills, right, which is where the vast majority of the cost of living crisis is coming from, outside of food as well, right? If you as 30p Lee would tell you, right, if you batch cook your meals, you eat thin slop and gruel, right? If you can increasingly ensure that you minimize your food expenditure and make sure that you don't buy anything frivolous with your food expenditure, you can keep that down even with food inflation being what it is. But none of that shit matters. None of that shit matters in the slightest if you have no money left after your basic bills and rent is paid, which is the case for thousands of people in this country.
Overall shopping bill won't come down anyway. I mean, I've campaigned to keep supermarket prices at a budget level myself over the last couple of years because of the cost of living crisis, but it's not a long-term solution. The onus shouldn't be on supermarkets to drive their prices down to poverty wages. The onus should be on employers and on the government to ensure that everyone's got a decent basic living standard.
Okay.
This is why every single time I watch this panel, I watch these question time programs, every time I look at the political discourse in this country, the common thread amongst every single thing is supply-side labour market reform. I'm sure everyone in chat is sick of me saying it, but it's so important to understand that people's wages haven't dropped in a vacuum. We're not £11,000 per person as per the Resolution Foundation studies. We're not £11,000 per person worse off than we would have been if wages had risen the same way they had done before 2010, right? Out of nowhere. This hasn't happened completely in a vacuum. In the same way, like German wages, they've increased, right? Even as immigration has increased, their wages have increased. They're not brought down wages of immigration, for example. Yet in the UK, our wages have been squeezed. We've been stuck on stagnant pay, continually behind inflation, both in the public and in the private sector. The public have obviously had the worst brunt of this since 2010. And this is down to specific government policy to ensure that this is the case. This is deliberate policy by the government to ensure that employers have the better bargaining chips than the workers who are bargaining with them. The kneecapping of the union movement, ensuring that you remove things like access to social services and welfare payments to ensure that people are forced into the lowest paying jobs possible because they're not competing with any kind of proper payments from our welfare sector. This is supply-side labour market reform, and this is what is to blame for the depressed wages in this country, and this is deliberate policy by the government. It's not happened because employers have just decided they don't want to pay people anymore, right? Because they've always, in capitalism, employers are always paying the lowest possible wages because that's what's in their financial and material interest to do so. But the way the market has allowed them to pay less by devaluing the value, by devaluing work itself as a commodity within the market, devaluing labour is specifically government policy that's allowed them to be able to depress wages. Otherwise, all the German employers would do the same thing if they could, but their labour market is different than ours because of the different way the market's been handled by government policy.
Okay. So, George, Lee is asking, when can he expect to feel financially better off again?
Well, the answer is within a few months, and I'll explain that. But I just take the first point. It is a very real crisis, and that's why the government's taking it so seriously. We've put in place a £94 billion package, cost of living relief. That's worth £3,500 to the average household. That is not a small measure. It is a huge and significant.
And again, I will come back to the main issue that we've seen with the failure of neoliberalism is how much money the state is having to pay out to be able to prop up the failures of neoliberal policy. Why do you think the state is paying huge amounts of cost of living support? It's because people's wages are low, because the government has implemented policy to ensure the wages are fucking low. In the same way they're paying out loads of money, keeping people's energy bills down, is because neoliberal policy have allowed energy suppliers and generators and extractors to make as much money as possible at the expense of high bills for everybody else on a naturalised monopoly. The reason why they're paying so much to subsidise people's energy bills is because our energy bills are way higher than everybody else's because our system is stupid. And again and again and again, neoliberals love the free market until it fails to be able to properly support society, and then they expect the state to pick up the tab. The same thing happened when we bailed out the banks. Every single time the market fails, the state is footed with the bill, and the state doesn't nationalise or gain the asset afterwards because of the neoliberal orthodoxy that has been supplying government policy for 45 years at this point. This is all policy. It's all policy. It's not just not just magicked out of the ether, this situation. It's been deliberate policy, and it's not just Conservative governments that to blame. New Labour followed this kind of macroeconomic precept as well.
Significant measure, and we've taken it because we understand and feel and share. In fact, it is just about everybody in this country is feeling it, but of course those on lower incomes are feeling it hardest, and that's why we've done what I think is the right thing. But I reject I'll come to when exactly and why, but I reject the notion it's a cost of conservatism. I know it suits Jack and Jess may have a bite at the same point. But it's not just that, because it's going on across the whole of Western Europe. It's going on...
Not as badly as us, though, right? Compare us in Western Europe. Compare our food inflation to places like Norway and places like France and places like Denmark, right? Compare our energy prices to the entire Eurozone, where they have agreements on wholesale gas prices across the actual Eurozone, for example, because they have the ability, essentially, for European states to collectively bargain for this kind of stuff. I'm using how collective bargaining is fine in the European Union, better so than here, which is unreal to think of. There's a reason why we are worse than everybody else, and not just in the EU, other countries too, who don't have the stupid macroeconomic policy that we do. And again, this is Thatcherism, so it's conservatism, right? But it's not the cost of conservatives. Again, we fall into the trap, and Jack has fallen into the trap, of talking about things in terms of team sports. It's the blue team that have done the bad thing, and the red team will fix it. Think of the policy. What ideology has precipitated the policy platform that we've seen? And it's conservatism. It's Thatcherism. The same Thatcherism that was not repudiated by the Blair administration and is currently not being repudiated by the Starmer opposition. The idea that you can just boot out the blue team and this will fix this problem is it's fantasy. It's complete fantasy. And Brexit is obviously to blame as well. There's obviously Brexit to blame too, but this shit was bad before 2016 for the identical reasons, just not as bad.
Across the world, actually, and it's been caused by a whole series of things. The pandemic, it was the biggest economic shutdown for 300 years. And shutting the economy and firing it up does not happen without huge damage to the economy. The cost of the Ukraine war...
So why did you allow £700 billion to go into the pockets of the rich, and why aren't you taxing it back? Of course, because that was the whole plan. The whole point of the way in which the COVID pandemic was handled economically by the government was to ensure that money filtered up to their mates in the bourgeois classes.
Or not just the physical cost of it, but Putin turning off the gas taps to trigger a Western European gas recession. So these are things that are very real. They're nothing to do with conservatism. They're going on all across Europe.
But inflation is going down faster in Europe than it is in the UK.
It is. So we have a problem in this. We have one or two really serious problems. Food inflation, particularly, is stubborn in this country. And there's a whole raft of reasons for that. And we're trying to get to the bottom of how we can try and ease that pressure. In the end, what you have to do is get inflation out of the economy. It's boring, but if you don't get rid of inflation, you will keep on chucking more and more money at the problem. Money will get less valuable. We've been there back in the 70s.
So the IMF and the Bank of England say...
What you need to do is ensure that you don't over-marketise everything, so everything is at the absolute whims of what the invisible hand of the market says should happen, right? I'm not saying that you need to centralise food production, but certain sectors of the economy would work better under state control. Gas extraction in the North Sea, for example, as I pointed out on stream the other day, for example. That's just one thing that we could do. We could have, as I mentioned on the last time Watch Question Time, we could have cooperative grocery retail, consumer cooperatives. So they take the profit motive out of the greedflation we're seeing as corporate profits are being used to fuel inflation, right? You can tax the rich and redistribute that so that the actual people at the bottom who are feeling the brunt of the cost of living crisis are the ones who get propped up by the rich people making the dividends as the result of it. That's the issue, right? And again, we don't have demand pull inflation. The idea that you'll make inflation worse by throwing money at it is not proven, because the economy, we don't have a hot economy. You can't have a cost of living crisis and an economy with too much demand at the same time. That doesn't make any sense.
Inflation won't reach 2%, which is the Bank of England target, until the middle of 2025. Others are saying until 2026. Is that how long Leah's going to have to wait?
No, it's not, and I'll explain why. So the good news is the OBR have just said we're not...
Oh, so there's good news, is there? It doesn't fucking feel like it.
...on target to go into recession this year, which was forecast. We're doing better than expected. Last 2 years, we've had the highest growth in the G7. This year, we're forecast to come out and get into growth later this year. On energy...
Who's the growth going to be for? Where's the growth going to go, right? Unless you fundamentally change the structure of the economy and the way that it's set up to benefit the rich, all economic growth will go into the hands of the richest people in this country, and it will not trickle down. It never has, never will. It's nonsense.
Energy bills, the forecast is, to your point, that because of our energy relief and the energy price cap, bills will start to fall from late June, and you'll see £430 in your pocket over the next 6 months. So there's a very real relief is coming. But
Oh,
I'm not-
great! I'll have half of my quarterly gas bill being paid over half the year. Thanks, government. Appreciate it. Cheers.
not going to suggest that life is suddenly going to be rosy. What we have to do is get the economy growing, get people back to work, and make sure we drive inflation out of this economy. It's not glamorous stuff, but if inflation continues to roar,
Okay,
everyone's
you've made that
pound
point.
gets less
So-
valuable in your pocket. We
Lee.
have to get rid of inflation.
You're shaking your head at some of that, quite a lot of that, actually. What did you think of what you heard?
The next 6 months, I'm not going to use a lot of gas and electricity. It's summer. It was great getting help over the winter, which is when prices were actually lower. I'm using the same amount daily as I am in the winter now. Things like council tax take 10% of my income. That's a big chunk for a single parent. Is that something we could look at reviewing?
Yeah, the best thing you can do on council tax actually is vote Conservative. Conservative council taxes are lower all around the country.
How's that
and it's
gone
a
for you?
major tax that hits,
How's that gone for the last
households.
13 years?
Jess?
I mean, the truth is, I really hate to say this, Lee. I wish I could say it was yesterday that you were going to get better off. But this isn't going to get better overnight. We need to grow our economy, improve our wage.
Okay, well, she's saying improving wages, right? I'm just sick of this, just grow the pie nonsense. Every single politician in this country is talking about growing the economy, and yet they're not talking about who's the economy growing for. At least Peter Kyle, to his credit, for all the Labour MPs that's been on Question Time, last week said that we need to grow the economy for the people at the bottom, right? We need to grow the economy and distribute those gains to the bottom. But, we'll see what Jess says here.
Wages in our country and mean that we can then spend the money on public services that Jack was talking about.
So if Labour wins the election, possibly as soon as next year,
Yeah.
and you're talking to Lee, how soon under a Labour government could you expect things to get better?
Well, I mean, there would be a couple of things. How old are your children, Lee?
Just turned 11 and nearly 8.
So one of the first things that Labour would do, literally on the first day of a Labour government, is give free breakfast club childcare, for example, for every primary school child. So that
No free lunches, though, right? No universal free school meals. Waiting a long time for that.
that would potentially be a saving. But I recognise, I've lived on benefits and had 2 children myself. And I was lucky enough to do it under a Labour government, and so I was pretty well looked after, actually. But the reality is that we have to have a plan, a proper growth plan for our economy that actually brings good jobs, good wages, brings about the change that when George says, we're not going into recession, get out a ticker tape parade. Does anybody feel like there's massive growth in our economy at the moment? Can you feel it? Until people in my constituency feel like it's...
And that's true, right? I rag on the Blair administration every day on this channel, and probably to my own detriment, man, I rag on the Blair administration. But Sure Start, absolutely 100%, was one of the greatest things that the Blair government did. And the fact that it got demolished like the instant the Conservatives took power, it just shows you how genuinely evil the Conservative Party and their politicians are. That a lifeline for kids, essentially, just the first thing to hit the chopping block on the austerity with the swing of the austerity axe.
Actually reaching them. I'm not going to wave a little flag and say, well done, Rishi Sunak. The reality is, and the Labour Party has a green industrial plan that has been said by many, many different captains of industry to be the only people on the pitch with regard to growth at the moment.
If I had my camera on, this would be where I would go full screen and I would stare incredibly sarcastically at the camera. The titans of industry have talked good about the green green prosperity plan. Yeah, I wonder who's going to get the dividends from that, from the GB Energy slush fund, Jess.
In house building, we just need to laser focus on having sustained growth in our country. So then you feel it, not just 400 quid one year, you feel 400 quid every year, every month.
Okay.
That's when it's going to change.
Man here in the front.
I think it's wholly lamentable that a G7 country finds itself in a situation where normally law-abiding citizens are resorting to shoplifting baby formula in this day and age. And also, I think it's time that we actually accepted that the levelling up agenda is not working. hasn't worked, and those funds are probably better directed to helping the people that need it now. I think on the price cap for the shops, that's a very blunt tool. The very upper classes and the middle classes are going to benefit. It's not targeted enough at the people that really need it. So less blunt tools, more targeted support for the people that need it. And it isn't a cost of living crisis, it's a cost of existing crisis for the average person on the street.
Okay. And the woman behind you in the stripy top.
Going back to the energy payments, which were fantastic, but do you think that a lot of people received it that didn't really need it?
Well, it was...
Oh, just so much of this stuff about the energy bill support, right, forgets to properly scrutinise the failures of energy policy to this point that have led us to the position where people are having, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of energy bills paid by the state. Again, the state is picking up the tab where the private sector has failed at the expense of the public sector, not in benefit of the public sector, right? The private sector is being paid off by the state for its own fucking failures. For its own failures.
It was across the board, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So inevitably that will be the case that some people who could afford to pay for it...
Yeah, some people got
the money anyway.
Didn't really need it.
The man there...
But, means testing would have probably cost more than the amount that they spend on propping up people's bills elsewhere. And even then, a lot of support went towards businesses, right? And keeping business costs low on the production end is what keeps the price of commodities down by ensuring that there's no cost push inflation from high energy prices on businesses that produce commodities, right?
And the blue jacket and the shirt.
So why is it the government always find the reason to blame everyone else and get everyone else to look for a resolution? They've got all this money to find for these pointless legal battles, so why don't they throw that into solving the real problems?
Chris Patten.
Just said the truth is, and the truth is that our political establishment is very reluctant to tell electors, to tell the great majority of people who are in the middle ground in British society what the truth is. And the truth is we're in one hell of a mess.
Yeah.
Our GDP per capita now is less than not only France, Germany, the Netherlands, it's lower than Ireland. It's lower, for heaven's sake, than Lithuania. The poorest 20% in Britain are poorer than the poorest 20% in Poland. That is...
Yeah, okay, Mr. MP in Thatcher's fucking administration. Whose fault do you think that was? Who do you think's to blame for the macroeconomic policy that's led us to being the most unequal society in the entirety of fucking Europe? Right? Okay, you want to put on the gigantic hot dog costume now, right?
It's not the sign of a community, of a country which has things going for it. I don't know if any of you listen to the Today programme. It's the way I wake up every day. And I listened to Larry Summers, the former American Treasury Secretary, this morning.
Yeah, the guy who literally is saying right now that in the US, working people have to get poorer to bring down inflation, right? Despite all of the record profits from the corporations, right? Larry Summers, the Democratic-appointed Treasury Secretary, no less, is the one who's saying that working people have to be forced to be made poorer by the Federal Reserve. There's an excellent interview with Jon Stewart and Larry Summers where Jon Stewart fucking destroys that guy and how anti-worker he is. Yeah, I'm not taking Larry Summers' word at anything. No, you cannot force me to take Larry Summers' words.
I'm talking about the world and talking about Britain. And he was arguing that Britain is in a much worse position than others. They were all facing a really difficult international situation. Why are we in a worse situation? First of all, because of inflation. And inflation is partly a result of us spending a great deal of money, which was necessary in order to deal with energy prices. And I think
there is no real evidence backing up the idea that a large amount of the current inflation is due to increase in the money supply. There has been no studies showing that that is the case. I would grant that around 5% potentially of the inflation is due to increase in the money supply, because that's the increase in price we're seeing on services in the economy. Services are up by 5%. The vast majority of our current retail price index inflation is coming from commodities that require energy to be produced, commodities that we import, which are going to be hit by the energy crisis and the the supply chain crisis coming out of the pandemic, and also by increased tariffs and lack of access due to the B word, which is obviously indeed Brexit, which I know that Chris is going to bring up because I've watched this spit already on Twitter. So there's no evidence that a large part of the inflation is due to increased demand because of increase in the money supply, right? Again, you can't have a hot economy with lots of demand and the cost of living crisis at the same time. These things are not compatible.
Rishi Sunak did that extremely well in the furlough scheme. It's also because of a lax monetary policy by the Bank of England. But it's also
wrong. Andrew Bailey even said this in a Treasury Select Committee that I was watching, that there was clearly plenty of base effects going into last year, and the increase of inflation was because people didn't take into account those base effects. And second of all, he rightly pointed out that for a vast majority of this time, this was all cost-push inflation, which again, if you're a monetarist, you don't believe this should exist. Milton Friedman didn't believe that cost-push inflation existed, right? And that's the economic orthodoxy that surrounds the Thatcherite monetarist economy, that is who are the kind of people who are going to be in the Monetary Policy Committee. But, there's no demand. The reason why you would increase interest rates early is to curb demand. But we already have no demand because we're getting stagflation, we're getting stagnant inflation, a stagnant economy with inflation at the same time. There's no excess of demand that's causing this inflation. It's increase in costs. Increasing the interest rates is not going to bring down inflation. It's just going to make people so poor they can't afford to live, which is why we're seeing, rents spiral, because the increased interest rates has increased mortgages, which allowed these costs to be pushed onto renters by landlords.
And this is a word one isn't supposed to use anymore. It's also because of Brexit. It's because of what Brexit did to the value of the pound. It's because of what Brexit has done to make it more difficult for us to import.
Holy shit, this is the architect of the poll tax? What? This guy can genuinely go and kick rocks. What a fucking piece of shit. What an absolute arsehole. But the problem is that even though Brexit is at least somewhat to blame, pancaking, that I recognised when I was reacting to the segment just a few seconds ago, the big issue here is that, again, this guy's a Thatcherist. This guy's in the Thatcher administration, no less, as an MP. This guy is neoliberalism through and through. He is the absolute epitome, the personification of neoliberal policy. So when we have all of these issues, as I've explained throughout this bit so far, that are the fault of neoliberal policy, things like the depression of wages, the increase in inequality, the failure of the market to be able to deliver on natural monopolies, to be propped up by the state using taxpayers' cash, using taxpayers' cash to do so, is that despite the fact Brexit is indeed to blame for some of the economic woes that we have, these economic woes, things like the gap between the poor and the rich and the immiseration of the working class and supply-side market reform leading to a depression in wages, this was all happening before Brexit, right? All happening before Brexit. People were struggling to live even before Brexit happened. Brexit has made things worse. I'm not saying that it hasn't made things worse, because it absolutely has made things worse. That's a fact, right? But for the vast majority of people in this country, it was already bad enough. And Brexit failing, because it has done, is a convenient excuse for people like Chris Patten, for people like Anna Soubry, people like David Gauke, and people like Dominic Grieve, people like Ken Clarke, people like Rory Stewart, people who voted for austerity, that supported neoliberalism, that were part of the Conservative governments that instrumented this stuff, and were never called out for the murderous ideology that they have supported, because they're suddenly saying, well, actually, we can say that Conservatives aren't to blame, just David Cameron's to blame because of Brexit, right? Or Boris Johnson's to blame because of Brexit. We can't blame our 45 years of failures in macroeconomic policy, because everything can be pinned to this little kind of Brexit scapegoat, if you like. Even though, because, it's true that it's to blame for some of it, just not all of it, and not, quite frankly, the key bits of it, right? The issue is middle class people are now being affected, and they need something to blame. And obviously, middle class people are usually pretty pro EU. So now the EU and Brexit is coming into sharp focus with regards to the issues that we're seeing at the moment. Because middle class people are suddenly affected by the cost of living crisis when they weren't, right? From 2020 to 2016, 2010, 2015 even, middle class people were seeing their mortgages rates stay low and their wages in the private sector usually rising at least somewhat par in line with inflation, maybe a little bit less, because most people's wages were being depressed at that point. And they thought, 5 years of coalition, let's vote for David Cameron again. Everyone below them was being socially murdered by the government. And now it's affecting them. Suddenly there has to be a scapegoat to blame outside of the economic policies that they know that they supported, right? They know, and in the back of their mind somewhere, they must know that the misery that's been inflicted on this country by conservative ideology is partially their fault for continuing to support it in their own selfish self-interest. And yet, that's why they will say things like, oh, I wish we could go back to 2012 during the Olympics. Yeah, in 2012, where were the fucking Sure Start centres for all the working class people being immiserated by the Conservative government? Where? They were nowhere, but you never used them, so you didn't care that they were gone, right? They didn't care, and after 5 years of back-breaking social murder on the poor by the Conservative government and David Cameron and George Osborne, they voted for more of the same. And these are the same people right now trying to blame everything on Brexit rather than acknowledging that Brexit is only part and parcel of a gigantic economic malaise that is the failures of 45 years of neoliberal Thatcherite policy being enacted by blue and red governments alike.
Goods and for us to import labour. And importing food now is costing us, according to the LSE, £7 billion more a year because we're outside the European Union. And until we start facing up to the realities of our life, to the fact that we can't possibly spend money on all the things we want, increase public spending and cut taxes. It's absolutely impossible. You can't do all those things. And I just wish, I think Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer...
What you need to do is you need to cut taxes on working people and massively tax the fucking rich. Okay, they've had £700 billion from the pandemic. That's increased asset prices, right? The increase in asset prices means that they're far out of reach of the middle classes who used to rely on these assets for being the aspirational quote-unquote class, right? Because the poor people, they've had all of their wealth taken away from them over the course of the last 13 years, or the 10 years, I guess, up to the pandemic, right? Since the start of the pandemic, now the rich people have started coming after the middle classes because they've run out of poor people to milk. Asset prices massively increased because all of this money that filtered up to the rich was being used to invest in assets. That's why, whilst everyone else is facing a cost of living crisis, right? Whilst everyone else is facing a cost of living crisis, the rich people, quite as Eddie Dempsey was saying, they're having a disco. Asset prices are increasing, house prices are increasing, the stock market's doing absolutely fine, whilst everyone else at the bottom is having to, steal baby formula to ensure their children get fed. If you really want to fix this country, if you really want to see a future where people have aspirations again, right? You want to have a wealth tax on the super rich to ensure that asset prices come down so that middle class can be aspirational again. And you want to make sure that you reverse all of these supply side labour market reforms that have deliberately depressed the wages of working class people for 45 years at this point. To balance between labour and capital, how our economy is stratified, so that working class people can then get the class mobility to become the aspirational middle class that will be helped by the wealth tax on the ultra-rich. And you can spend that tax from the ultra-rich on supply-side interventionist reforms, on new housing, new energy, for example, new cooperative funds, better welfare so that people have better alternatives with regards to the labour market as well. Right? You can fix this economy, but you have to be bold, you have to be daring, you have to revolutionise the way our economy works, you have to reverse neoliberalism. You have to nationalise the natural monopolies that we are being absolutely, with the grand larceny on our natural resources that's happened to us, not just from the assets that our country owned before the 1980s, whether they were sold off, but the larceny out of our own pockets that we're paying in sky-high bills to keep the shareholders of these energy companies in Rolexes.
A decent human beings. I just wish they would fess up to the fact that we have to tell people what they're going to have to expect in the next few years, because I think it's going to be very tough to get out of the hole that we're in.
I hate that they're applauding this.
Chris, you sound very disappointed with this government. Which is interesting, given that you are a former and very prominent former Conservative cabinet minister.
Well,
and I mentioned the next election to Jess.
Yeah, well,
do you think the Conservative government will win the next election? Do you think they deserve to win the next election?
Well, you referred to the fact that I'd been in the past the chairman of the Conservative Party. I was the chairman of the Conservative Party when there was one.
See, even now, he's saying things were better under the worst government ever this country's ever seen, under Margaret Thatcher, when this guy was trying to implement the fucking poll tax, and he's saying, well, actually, we were the real conservatives. Yeah, well, if the kind of conservatism that you think is good is a fucking poll tax, Chris, then, quite frankly, you can go fuck yourself.
I'm still a conservative.
And they're applauding. They're applauding this man for trying to say that Thatcherism was good. Look, this is all of the problems that you're seeing right now of the consequences of Thatcherism, and he's telling you that somehow Thatcherism is better than this, kind of, I guess, this weird kind of kleptocracy that's going on at the moment, which I guess maybe that is at least somewhat true. But there's still conservatism. It's still both bad. Oh God, the amount of the absolute gluttons of punishment the British public are, right? The absolute cucks they are to their fucking corporate masters and their establishment masters in the public school, university, Oxbridge University intelligentsia, like this fucking guy. They're so cucked out. It's unreal. It's unreal. Unreal.
Conservative, and I'm a conservative for the same sort of reasons that Michael Heseltine is a conservative, or Ken Clarke. I don't find I have very much in common with, for example, some of the flat earthers on the right of the Conservative Party, any more than
Yep, apparently, guys, Heseltine was not on the right of the Conservative Party. Apparently, future YouTube viewers and current Twitch viewers, apparently not. Apparently, the neoliberal Chancellor Extraordinaire is a moderate in comparison to the current Conservative administration, which is ironic considering that Boris Johnson's probably the most left-wing, ironically, most left-wing Conservative Prime Minister we've had since Ted Heath.
Jess would have had any much sympathy for Jeremy Corbyn, about whom she was extremely brave in the past. I really do think that we want, if we're going to get out of this mess, to be honest about the issues that face us and get out of the ideological bolt holes, and also stop thinking that policy is about getting headlines in the tabloid papers. Policy is more serious than that.
OK, so do you think the Conservatives...
the problem is it never has been about that. Policy's always been about the headlines, right? Especially when you're a Conservative government, as we've seen, where the entirety of Conservative ideology and the role of the Conservative Party is to maintain power indefinitely. Right? They will absolutely compromise on their ideology whenever it's possible, as long as it means remaining in power, and that's always been the case. There was the only person who has tried to win an election off of genuine policies that aren't supposed to be headlines, and I hate to say the same name yet again, but it's fucking Jeremy Corbyn. Every single time, it's always the answer to the question.
Could do with the time a spell in opposition.
Having avoided spells in opposition in the past when people said it'd be really good for you, and I remembered what it was like in opposition. Boom! Terrible. As Jess would, it's really awful. What I hope is that the next election is fought between the two big parties on the basis of telling people the truth about the state of our economy and what needs to be done. And I think that's...
She'll get neither of them, because neither of them are going to get a wealth tax.
That goes for housing policy, it goes for the health service, it goes for dealing with the elderly. We actually have to be honest, and there are occasions when the two...
His honesty, when he says NHS, right, when he says we need to be honest about the NHS, there's only one thing that he means by being truthful about the NHS. He means privatisation, chat. It's the only thing that he means. He means he wants to privatise it. He's a Thatcherite. That's his goal. That's their goal. That's what they want. Honesty about the health service means privatisation. In the same way that reform of the health service means privatisation.
Two big parties should work together. Why don't we work together on issues like the care of the elderly and the Dilnot report and so many other things? We should actually work together on a number of issues instead of scoring points off one another.
I agree. So, George, I better let you respond.
A Conservative funds social care. What planet do you live on, Zeode?
So, I I heard you saying hear to some of what Chris Patten said. I didn't hear you saying hear when he said I was a member of the Conservative Party when there was one. What do you make of that?
Well, everyone always says that. He's earned the right
I'm not sure they
to
do.
be able to. He's earned the right to be able to say it. Look, I agree with much of what Chris said, and I've always been a huge admirer and fan of his. And the only thing I would add is, if we're going to be honest, which I would love us to be, and talk about cross-party, I set up the Big Tent Festival, and Jess has been, and Nimco, who would have been here, has been. We do need a much more mature debate. I think the young and others in this country want the truth. They want to know and have a proper debate, and they're ready for it. And I think we're in a situation where successive parties have been trying to promise jam tomorrow, and actually people want to know what is the mess today properly. So I buy that. The only thing is, I think you need to add to that list a problem of ever-increasing expenditure on the NHS, for example. Since I've been in Parliament 13 years, it's gone up a third. It's gone from 30-odd% of public spending to 40-something odd. You're not seeing a third increase in output on the ground, in your GP, in your dental practice. Where's it all going? I'm not blaming anyone in the NHS. I'm just saying...
Where's it going? It's going on private contracts. And the shareholders and CEOs of the private companies that used to be done in-house for cheaper, with better wages for the actual staff themselves. That's where the money's gone. And guess who is to blame for that? And what ideology is to blame for that? Why are we paying more money for agency nurses rather than having nurses paid properly in-house?
We also have a problem of inefficient, unmodernised public services, which I'd add to the list that Chris set out. And on Brexit, for what it's worth, look, I voted Remain because I felt that there would always be a short-term cost. And if you do it, you have to deliver a medium and long-term gain. And I think we're now in that very difficult bit where the costs are obvious.
So you agree with Chris that it is costing...
I think
it's that we are paying the cost of Brexit in our food bills?
I think it has had some costs. But I also think there are some real advantages. And when Jess talks about creating a new economy, I'm not...
Incredible. The absolute fucking gigantic, like, monster cope from this Remainatory MP being forced onto their nonsensical party line over Brexit. Oh, we promised there are definitely Brexit benefits somewhere. Honestly, no. They were there somewhere, even though I think that they're all wrong and I voted against them.
Not taking any lectures from anyone on that. I've had a whole career, 15 years of venture capital, building new businesses. We've set up a new department. We're growing. The industries of tomorrow here.
All right.
And regulatory freedom, whether it's in autonomous vehicles or in AI or in agri-tech or in medicine.
Apparently the answer is just to keep deregulating. I'm going insane. I'm going to have an aneurysm on stream. I will be, at least if I have an aneurysm, I won't have to deal with these abscesses anymore. But, oh my God, this is infuriating.
And drug discovery, those regulatory freedoms are hugely valuable to attract money. So it's not as simple as Tories bad, Labour good, spending, all spending good. We have to have a proper debate about how we take your money and invest it better for tomorrow's public services and economy.
OK, I'm going to move on from this subject and take another question, which...
Oh, my God. I'm sorry, as much as I'm enjoying this stream today, and thank you very much for that, I have to stop there, otherwise I will literally lose my tiny little mind. I not only have a small brain, and I cannot comprehend this much complete, absolute nonsense in one stream, and there was no pushback. There was very little audience interaction with this point either. Like, this is the question, right? If I was in the audience for this one, which I really was going to try, I was asked to be, and I couldn't go, which is incredibly frustrating, I would have ripped these fuckers a new one, right? Absolutely just demolish these people in the theoretical marketplace of ideas. Because we're getting no solutions, just more Thatcherism, more deregulation. Honestly, I'm at my wit's end with this country and both of these major parties and politics in general. Why do I do this to myself? If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.